Hi all, and welcome to the final edition of the roundtable for the Gender Studies cluster of Nickel and Dimed, which is the official research and publication platform. Today we have panelists Vrinda, Adya, and Isha, and myself, and the conference will be moderated by Oshi. I'll just now hand over the mic to her to kind of speak on what we are going to discuss about and carry forward the conversation.
Thank you, Shashank. So today our roundtable would would be a discussion on the Ukraine and Russia war and the gendered violence that is going on. As it comes to, I think today it marks the 300 day of the war, and as the past has been with all the wars that we have seen, um, there has been like a parallel war women have been facing, in which they face violence, especially sexual violence. And today we will be discussing that sort of control and power dynamics that will come with a war state between two nations. So to sort of start the discussion, as I mentioned, it's gendered violence. So is it only restricted to sexual violence, and why is it not? What kind of other violence do women face during such international hostilities? Yes, Isha, go on.
So one of the things that I was sort of reading up on was about the number of child marriages. So that's like another thing for violence because that opens you up to like domestic violence, again sexual violence, and child marriage as a thing in itself. And one of the reasons for that is because families are sort of unable to like care for their existing children, so they have to like reduce the burden by sort of having one child go on to another family. So that was one of
I'm sorry if you could like speak closer to your mic. Your voice is a bit unclear.
is this better?
Yeah, go on. We just missed your last point. The rest was clear. Yeah.
Okay. I think I was mentioning something about like parents having to sort of reduce the burden on their existing kids as well. So by having one child sort of ready, like going away to the family, have like a better.
I think we lost Isha. Adya, if you could talk about your points.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I couldn't really hear what Isha said, so I'm sorry if I'm just repeating that. But what I think another point is that the economic burden, like since women's economic status is already a lot lower, especially in a volatile country like Ukraine. So in times of crisis, when the the economic condition is dipping, the female labor force participation also goes down. So women's capacity to fend for themselves, for their children in areas where they're probably like single mothers or something like that, that'll become even more difficult. And that's just another extension of how the vulnerable sections are. I'm sorry. The vulnerable sections are more affected in times of war. That's just a universal truth, and women are just an example of that.
Yes, Linda, you can go on.
I agree with what Adya said, and just to add on to that, I also think the violence is political because I think it's a regression of everything that the feminist movement has done so far. For example, even when you militarize a population, that militarization of the population in itself is very gendered. And when an economy and a country is centered around military, it's centered around its military power. I think in some ways it automatically reduces women to be secondary citizens because it's deemed that it is the men who will be protectors of the country, while women then go back to staying within the confines of their homes, taking care of the family. So I think it's also a regression of how far the feminist movements have come um, over the years. Yeah.
Yeah, those are two really important points that Adya and Brinda have brought up. First, about the sort of systemic violence that extends during such hostile state of two nations, and then Brinda's sort of view on gender as a norm and how it sort of works in such international conflict state. But this sort of brings us to the next question. As we have already discussed how serious the state of both Russia and Ukraine, not just Ukraine, uh, which is uh, which is getting attacked by Russia as of now, are facing such serious gendered violence issues, especially in terms of rape and sexual assault. What are the reasons which are making Ukraine specifically not respond to this crisis as well as the other crises they are facing? Because they have been able to respond to many other crises, especially the recent power plant attacks that they have had to suffer through. So, what do you think are the reasons for that? Yes, Adya and then Sasha.
Yeah, so from the sources that I've read, I feel like this is a very specific problem, that is Russian soldiers barging into Ukraine and then committing sexual violence on their women and children. And Ukraine is not legally equipped to take care of these issues. Like their existing provisions are not enough, and apparently there's a bill that's still in the process that hasn't just been enacted into law, and that could solve a lot of these problems that hasn't been, and that could make Ukraine's legal framework very consistent with the international obligations that it is required to fulfill, and that's just not being done. And I think that's one of the core reasons why Ukraine is not able to deal with this issue.
Yes, Shashank, go on. You're not audible. Yeah, yes, go on.
Wait, it's on. Yeah, wait, I think I'm audible now. So sorry. Okay, cool. Sorry. Just adding on to what Adya said, I think the lack of legal framework that's not there rather in Ukraine right now. That's also been aided by the fact that there's no proper reporting as such. It's those troublesome scenarios wherein something is happening, but you don't have the conclusive evidence to prove it is happening, and that comes from the reporting aspect. So the delay in reportings, either because of the trauma, the fear, the insecurities of the victims, and they kind of don't really wanna report, or because simply data is unavailable. If you want to collect data, you need to go to that certain place, but unfortunately, either that place is being now occupied by a foreign power, or even the government restricts access to it. So kind of when this kind of interplays along with what Adya said, when you don't have a proper legal structural framework to kind of address this kind of victimization, that kind of perpetuates the problem even further.
Thanks, Vrinda and then Isha.
Right. So I also wanted to add that because because the violence exists within the framework of the war, wherein the very defense at times requires the militarization of civilian men who have been given no training to take this on within a humanitarian framework. I think the suddenness of this and the lack of laws in the times of crisis is also something that's perpetuating this violence and also allowing this violence to continue existing.
Isha.
I hope you guys can hear me better. Is this good? Am I audible?
Your voice is not clear.
Is it better
So,
now? Hello?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to sort of compound on everyone's points. because I think a major reason is because there's so much conflict in Ukraine. The women issue has sort of been put on the back burner. And there is also not a lot of support from the international community. I don't know if you guys have seen the news about how Ukraine was trying to release a message about this in the conflict I think between the FIFA finals, and that message was sort of censored. And I think this sort of censorship is one of the reasons that the women's issue has not been consistently because of the lack of support.
You sort of, I couldn't hear you in the end, but I got the gist of your point that the gendered violence is sort of getting pushed back between all the other sort of major issues that Ukraine is facing, and there is not a lot of international support from other, especially European countries, who are very vocal about Ukraine's status in the war. And other important points from the other panelists also about the lack of legal structure and framework, and also the lack of reporting on the issue. Which this sort of brings me to the next question. Brinda sort of hinted on it in one of her points, that there's this sort of question coming up on gender itself, what gender means during war, because it's not just, of course, it's women who are suffering a lot because of their identity, and they have to face sexual assault constantly. But it many implications, especially associated with masculinity, go ignored, and there's a certain kind of side to this as well, the kind of violence men face, but it's not visible. So, what are your thoughts about that? Sorry, Adya and then Brinda.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't hear you. So what I found is that in times of like war related crisis like this, there's a lot of focus on like fighting, being violent, and defending your country. So especially in Ukraine, there's been a lot of forced conscription of men. Like they're forcibly drafted into the war, and not all of them, might want to fight or engage in this kind of violence, which is completely understandable. But there's no time to think of these kinds of, like, both sides are wrapped up in their own problems, and so there's no time to consider anyone's individual wishes, and all men have to be, like, as a society, even like men, women, children, a lot of people have to be forcefully, like, conscripted into the war. And that's one of the problems that are not women specific, but like society specific. That's one point I have.
Also, just to draw from Adya's point, when masculinity becomes such a centered, such an important conversation, because the war and who gets to defend the country depends on it. I think who is masculine, who is not, who is a man, who's not, also becomes a question, where like transness and queerness are constantly there's something, there are notions that are not considered, there are notions that are not spoken about. So I think it's also trans men and trans women, and generally people who don't fall into those two rigid binaries. That's where that conversation gets sidelined and those identities get sidelined.
Shashank and then Isha.
Yeah, just kind of drawing on some more points from both Adya as well as Vilda. So when we actually, as kind of Isha said in her previous answer, so when this kind of conversation gets negated into the background, because bro, war's going on, what are you talking? Let's all fight, let's defend our country. So we kind of lose track of actually what's important and what's not important in these kind of scenarios, and that's when you try to you try to conform yourself to this traditional notion of masculinity, and it's not just like men per se, adult men, but even like boys or adolescent boys. You're like, you're gonna be a man someday. Come on, fight for your country, defend your country. That kind of stereotypes are being perpetuated by these kind of acts of, as Adya said, the forced conscription kind of, it kind of reinforces those ideologies, right? And as Brinda also rightly said, so right now, it's not just the rigid binaries. Now, the trans women as well, even in their papers, because they were somehow still identified as men, even they are not led to kind of, escape to other countries because of the war. So, and that has a psychological impact as well. That kind of, connects to the first question. In a way, that is psychological violence. You kind of add on to the depression, you kind of add on to the anxiety and the stress on mental health. Are they going to take me away and then force me to join the army and I'm going to get killed? That perpetuates it. So it kind of creates this vicious cycle because we are not addressing the gender issues there.
Yes, Isha, you can go on.
So this is kind of like compounding on everyone else's answer. So I was reading this paper where it said that in wartime, men and women are like put into these gender roles. Men fight while women flee. So that like sort of characterizes. It also creates a stigma against men who are unwilling to participate in the war and like forced conscription again, like Arya said. Another point that I wanted to talk about is that though we look at sex crimes as gendered violence, there has been quite a few reports of men also being sexually assaulted and minors, especially minor men being tied up and sexually harassed. So these also exist and they're also sort of overlooked. Because sure that this has happened to men against men. So this is also like it's not entire sexual crimes cannot entirely.
Thank you, Isha. That's a very important point. As we all have known, military is sort of known for committing sexual violence both within the military and outside. And these concepts of the military, the war, nations, borders have always been really patriarchal, very masculine terms, ideas, as talked about Benedict Anderson's papers as well. Um, really important points there about the idea of masculinity that gets questioned during war times. Um, and how men have to sort of stick to this particular idea about how a good citizen, a good male citizen should act during wartime. To move on to a conclusive question for this roundtable, do we think that if the war ends, this gendered violence that is caused by the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is also going to end. Like after this conflict resolves, do we think when the military goes back home and the conflict has officially ended, do we think the gendered violence will also end? Yes, Sashank, and then Brinda.
Trying to kind of paint a very gloomy picture, but unfortunately, I do not think it is going to end. In fact, it might even rise up. It might even increase. So, and it's not just in this Ukrainian and the Ukraine-Russian war context, but even generally, if you were to take the conflicts actually in the violence against women, or just broadly speaking, gender violences do increase just after the war gets over as well. We saw even during COVID, when people were actually more locked up in their homes, the cases of actually gender violence and sexual assault increased. And that has similarly, it might pan out here as well, as kind of men come from the war and the soldiers come from the war, having a lot of war trauma or kind of like PTSD scenarios. They might not be in the right mental state to kind of go back to their familial life, as a result of which I fear that the violences that might be committed against both men, minor boys, as Isha said, that might also continue to rise. unless connecting to Adya's point, unless we don't kind of try to put in place the structural framework and the legal framework that's specifically taken care to address this scenario, unless we don't have a proper framework to do that and the structure in place, it's gonna continue further.
I agree with Sashank. I also think it's not going to end with the war. I think one of the major reasons why it's also going to perpetuate after the war is the psychological trauma that people will go through, because that doesn't end as the war ends. And I think that will cause a rise of domestic violence. But I also think this war in itself will take a larger hit to the economy of both the countries, for that matter. And I think that economic shock is also gendered in a lot of ways, because when you try to kind of cut down on costs, it's often on women, it's often on I think, as somebody earlier mentioned, there's a rise of child marriages because the domestic household can't bear the cost of all the children. So I think that in itself, the economic toll that the war will take is something that will continue, which in turn will um with it the violence against women and the violence in general will continue.
Yes, Adya.
Yeah, so both Shashank and Vrinda have covered most of the major points, but that's what I feel like. The violence within the war will have like long-lasting effects, and politically, all the progress that has been made in terms of, say, women's rights, human rights, child rights, it'll all become very regressive, and the country will have to, because it'll be in such shambles, it'll have to start from scratch, and so all the forms of redress that women may have had before, they won't have it again, and they'll be exposed to a lot more violence. Even, I mean, I'm going out of the limb and saying more violence than before because of the long-lasting effects of the war. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It does, as Prashant mentioned, it does paint a very gloomy picture that even after the war ends, it sort of continues. And as we all know, war doesn't leave even one person unaffected, and it's a sad time for both, not even just Ukraine and Russia, but for all for everyone to sort of question where we are going with this sort of idea of humanity in itself, and sort of questioning our morals, even during such times when we assume everyone's safe. So thanks everyone for your views on this really serious issue, which had to be discussed. And we discussed some really relevant points relating to the gendered violence of the conflict that is going on between Ukraine and Russia. Thanks everyone.